Good morning, and thank you for coming to the seminar today. Our speaker is Andrew Dankers, and he's going to talk about Primate-Inspired real-time active vision. Andrew is just about to finish his PhD, so congratulations and well done. And he has received his BSc in physics and BE from ANU. And his current supervisors are Nick Barnes and Alex Zelinsky. He has also done a short internship in ATR Japan under supervision of Gordon Chang. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'm working with this active vision head, and we're interested in active vision for scene awareness and especially an attentional sort of perception of the scene. So we want to work with real scenes, moving dynamic visual stimulus. We want to be able to do it in real time, and we really want it to work in a variety of environments and be useful for a flexible system, useful for multiple tasks. So here's just a quick video of the actual unit gazing around. So what it's doing is saccading quite quickly between different points, regions of interest in the scene, and I'll describe later exactly how it's doing this. But as you can see, it's really quite fast in its motion and pretty accurate as well. It's 3 degrees of freedom, so it's got a common tilt axis and independent pan axes. It's got a range of motion similar to that of a human, so about 100 degrees and 45 degrees viewing angle for these set of cameras. It's cable drive, so there's no backlash involving gearing, and it's got a parallel architecture, so no motor bears the weight of any other. It's just bearing the weight of support structures in the cameras. So it can also do about 4 or 5 point-to-point return saccades in a second, whereas a human can only do 2 or 3, about 3. So it's a little bit faster than humans in saccades. Okay, so we're dealing with moving cameras, so and variable camera geometries. I won't go into this in too much depth, but there's a reference there if you're interested. But for two views of a scene coming off the cameras, where the cameras aren't parallel, if they're slightly verged, well then the 2 images won't be such that horizontal lines, for example, are continuous across the scene, and it won't be such that things in horizontal scan lines line up. So we do apply rectification to deal with that. So then horizontal lines remain horizontal. So basically we're enforcing epipolar, parallel epipolar geometry for those of you familiar with multiple view geometry. But for everybody else, we just distort the images with a tomography. Basically, I project the images through the camera onto a virtual wall behind the active head, and that projection projects the image, enforces the epipolar geometry, parallel epipolar geometry, and also positions the picture on that virtual wall in a globally epipolar rectified mosaic. So once you have a left mosaic and a right mosaic, so 2 of those things in the bottom right corner there, I'll actually exit out of there. PowerPoint seems to play that rather slowly. So then you can do online epipolar rectification. So it's distorting each image with that tomography that's detected purely by the geometry of the active head. I'm not using image-based techniques to determine the geometry. I'm reading it straight off the encoders. So I've cut a corner there to get some real-time performance. But as you can see, if I put my finger on the ball, say, it stays on the ball as the saccade changes, as the gaze angle changes. So we've projected the images into a static reference frame, and you can build up the entire mosaic of the left, for the left and the right images, and then you can do static stereo algorithms with active cameras. So basically operating on the mosaic rather than just the images. So then you can do things like depth mapping and other stereo algorithms. So we've converted active to static. So any static algorithm will work. So depth mapping is how we do spatial perception. A lot of you are probably familiar with depth mapping, but basically you look at the disparity in a pixel. So say the corner of this filing cabinet, it's moved by 20 pixels or so, so that gives us some information about the depth of field, whereas the chair, it hasn't moved. So you can build up a depth map where the white things are closer, and the darker they are, the further in depth they are away from the cameras. That is a pretty dirty depth map, but we're interested in real time, so that's okay. We've got ways to deal with that later. And we're only doing a disparity search for the plus or minus, say, 16 pixels, so we're putting a constraint on that. So that gives us a measurable volume in the scene that's sort of static. It's not doing the whole disparity search over for all objects in the scene. But as you scan this fixed disparity range over the scene, you can then build up a perception of where a lot of the visual surfaces are in the scene. So in the top left there, the cameras are verged in, so we can really only detect things close to the, perhaps in this volume here, but as the cameras scan out, you can detect a bigger area that's further away. So that's how you build up a perception of where visual surfaces and mass are in the scene. So those depth maps that give us information about this varying volume in the scene can be incorporated into an occupancy grid representation. So basically every pixel in the depth map, its position in the occupancy grid can be determined, and we increase the likelihood of that cell being occupied using a sensor model. I'll get into that in a bit. But we've constructed the occupancy grid. We've tailored it for use with stereo vision. So basically the cells are smaller near the camera, near the active head. And as you get further away, the cells get bigger, in line with the effect of a pixel disparity at whatever depth it happens to be. So 1 pixel of disparity near the cameras corresponds to a smaller possible volume than 1 pixel of disparity further away from the camera. Also, each slice in the occupancy grid has the same amount of cells in the X and Y direction, so ray tracing is really easy. If a ray passes through, say, this top corner in one slice of the occupancy grid, it passes through the same coordinates in every slice in the occupancy grid. So inputting sensor data is quite easy. And this is how this is the sensor model that we used. Basically, this is the ideal situation where if you detect a disparity pixel that corresponds to this depth, well then you decrease the likelihood of everything in front of that being occupied. You increase the likelihood of that one being occupied, and everything else you tend back towards 0.5 because you don't know anything about what's behind the cell that's given this depth response. That's the ideal model. We use a more realistic model. We basically just increment the likelihood of that cell being occupied. Everything else in front is set towards 0, everything behind is tended towards don't know or 0.5. So this is the kind of thing we achieve. So we're basically looking over the active head shoulder here. This is the scene, it's just the same one. I've put some texture onto the chair because the depth response is a little better with texture from the depth maps that we use. So it's from the depth map, it's building up this occupancy grid representation of volume in the scene. So once you've done that, you can reproject the scene back onto the occupancy grid, so you know where mass is, where free space is, and you even know what it looks like in this coarse occupancy grid. It's pretty forgiving, so that the granularity of the occupancy grid accepts smooths out error in actual localization in the depth map. So the depth maps can be noisy and not accurate, but it's all sort of smoothed out by the granularity of the occupancy grid. You can also reproject the flow, optical flow, back onto this, which then gives you the X and Y vectors of each cell in the occupancy grid. So you can see my hand's moving down, my head's moving back. So there's the cluster of vectors corresponding to my hand, cluster of vectors corresponding to my body. The depth, so we've got the X and the Y from projecting an optical flow map back onto the occupancy grid, but the depth map, the depth direction comes from analysing consecutive depth maps to get the third vector, the third component of the vector. You can also, we ran the occupancy grid thing in the smart car. The active head is mounted upside down in the smart car. And by looking at the occupancy grid from the side on, you can see, you can detect the ground plane. Basically, a lot of the road, which is at the same sort of horizontal level, has a depth response, which increases the likelihood of a lot of the cells just under this plane. And if you look at the occupancy grid from the side, you'll get a line basically corresponding to the road, and just assume it's planar. You can hypothesize that that's where the road is. So I'll show you a couple demo films. We've got the left and right image and the depth map. What we've done is just taken the overlapping part from the current frames in the mosaic. We've got a depth map from that area, and building the occupancy grid from that. So you can see if I move the cameras, the position of the chair remains the same because it's been projected into the static reference frame of the mosaic. So the measurable volume, as I'm changing the geometry of the cameras, moves beyond the chair and closer than the chair. But when the chair's in that measurable volume, it gives a depth response, and we can put it back in the occupancy grid. And I'm not sure whether the contrast is enough to see the velocity here, but left-right images, there's a left and right optical flow. So there's a whole heap of little arrows showing optical flow in the scene, depth map, and subtraction of consecutive depth maps to get the depth direction. And unfortunately, you can't see too well the vectors. Can I dim the lights?
Yeah, but just switch the light.
Okay. I'm not sure if that helps much. You might be able to see them flashing a little bit.
It's getting better.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, and so as I move the cameras up and down, it moves the location of the image in the mosaic. So, but the mosaic itself, the position of the image in the mosaic stays static. So even though I'm moving the cameras up and down, there isn't a field of vectors induced in the entire occupancy grid, in the entire optical flow map. So we've accounted for the deliberate motion of the active head, basically, and removed that from flow calculations. And you can segment stuff in the occupancy grid space, but I won't show that. So this is where I was talking about driving down the road and extracting the ground plane. So it's just hypothesizing based on the numerous responses along the road of where the road actually is. It's pretty noisy. Okay, that brings me to the next slide. So a bit of an aside here on stabilization. When you are driving down the road, if you hit a bump, then the images shift, which puts all of the depth response pixels in the occupancy grid into the wrong spot. It might shift the occupancy grid up and down. So you can stabilize that. And this is a pretty simple stabilization method. The image on the left here is the original image. So you can see that the bull bar is pretty much the same distance above the bottom of the picture. On the right, we stabilized it, so it artificially goes up and down to keep the ground plane stable. So that's image-based stabilization, which allows us then, given that the cameras were kept in a static position, to build the occupancy grid up in a static manner so that the occupancy grid didn't raise and lower. So you can really only do that at frame rate. The other technique, and the thing that humans do. We've got hardwired circuitry that connects our sense of stability, our sort of gyro in our ears, to our vision system. So basically, the top image-based stabilization is like if I'm looking at my hand and I move my hand, I can track it pretty well, but if it gets too fast, it gets blurry. But if I move my head, I can move my head as fast as I like, and I'll still be able to see the crisp image here because we've got this much higher frequency control injected into the control loop. So we did that as well. That's Preston mentioned I was at the ATR. That's basically what I did. So we've got a color tracker. So this is just tracking this ball based on the fact that it's yellow. And it's reasonably fast. It's independent, so the left eye doesn't know anything about what the right eye is looking at. If you introduce some nodding, then the tracking, and the nodding is not coupled to the vision in any way, it's just moving the head. You can see that it loses track, and the images are quite blurry. It's not really tracking that well. It's got a bit goofy. But if you turn on the VOR, vestibular ocular reflex, which is this hardwired circuitry from the ECI, then it keeps the ball in the centre quite statically, which allows it to continue the tracking task quite nicely. And you can get quite stupid, so now it's nodding, shaking, and tracking, and I'm perturbing it quite violently, and it still tracks the ball. The slow colour tracker is allowed to continue because the high rate. So that was quite fun. Made a good demo film. Anyway, okay, so back to the sort of lab conditions where things aren't as violent as that. So we've got this perception of where visual surfaces are in the scene and how they're moving, but we've got no concept of coordinated fixation or foveal segmentation of objects in the scene. Humans find it difficult to fixate on things halfway between me and, say, the wall. I have to fixate on the wall or the floor. I have to fixate on a visual surface, unless I cross my eyes, in which case I don't get any information. So we'd like the system to exhibit a similar ability. And basically what we do is formulate a zero disparity filter. So I've made a slide in the next. I should warn you that this flashes quite a bit, but I don't think the contrast will affect you. Okay, so you can see I'm flashing the left and right images consecutively quite fast. And you can see that things like the computer are moving quite a bit, but the hand stays relatively in the same position. Because we're fixated on it, it's at zero disparity. It projects to the same retinal coordinates or the same image coordinates in the left and the right image. So all we're doing is extracting the area that has this left-right stability, basically. I am here doing a bit of template matching in the fovea to shift the image to try and keep whatever's in the middle there fixated. But if I move beyond this 5 or 10 pixels, then the hand also moves. But when it matches up, then you can start trying to extract what areas are at zero disparity and what aren't. Okay, so basically when it does overlap, and you detect it through a template match or correlation that you've got some overlap here, then you can try to extract the regions in the fovea that are actually overlapping. Now I've defined the fovea as the size of a fist at arm's distance, which is roughly in line with human. So I'll describe how I'm getting that probability map on this slide. So basically, this is quite simple. It's not exactly what I'd end up doing, but it gives you an idea of how that process works. I just look at every small kernels along here and say take this 5 by 5 area, correlate it with this 5 by 5 area. If it correlates well, I increase the likelihood of that being at zero disparity. If it doesn't correlate well, I decrease it. So, for example, where this Y is here, I don't know if you can see that Y on the blackboard in the background. It's not in here because we're fixated on the hand, the background's shifted. So that gives a big black response in the zero disparity probability map. I've also, land areas will always correlate well. So areas like white here will correlate really well because there's no texture there. So I've used the difference of Gaussian kernel to get rid of the texture, to get rid of the probability responses in those areas that are textureless. So things like palms are also set to 0.5 because we don't really know. There's no intensity information, no texture to tell us whether or not it's at zero disparity. Okay, so you've got these probability maps, and you can try to align the probability maps, which is always a difficult thing to do because they're just distributions. So we try to actually segment the object that corresponds to this probability map. So basically, what I've done is used contextual information to propagate the probabilities to the edges in the image. So this is a strong edge around the hand here. So we create a cost function that says things that we want to label at zero disparity can propagate over pixels that look the same in the image until they hit a hard border. That's where we prefer the labeling to change, which means that this sort of black area will propagate until it hits an edge, and this white area will propagate until it hits an edge. So a bit of Markov theory helps us do that. This slide's an example of how important contextual information that you can include from Markov theory is. So for two given images, the left and the right image like this, we perceive that this box has moved a little to the right, but there are in fact three correct answers. The whole image could have moved, in which it's all black because none of it's at zero disparity. Just these vertical edges could have moved, which means the rest of the image is at zero disparity, but the vertical edges aren't. Or just the box has moved, which is more in line with human perception. And that's what the cost function that we've tailored brings out. There's a reference to that in the top right corner to a journal we've done on that. All right, so anyway, that allows us to do quite fast. Oh, I should say that I do the optimization using graph cuts. And it works pseudo real-time because there's only two classes it's trying to segment, and it's a very small area, so we can do it quite fast. So you can see it's segmented quite nicely, the hands. Even though it's low resolution, we're only looking at this area. It's giving quite good segmentations. It's tracking the hand by trying to keep the maximum area of white at zero disparity. Basically, as I said, there's a little bit of template matching going on in the Foveal where it'll try to align it. It'll check the response of the zero disparity filter at that location. If it got it wrong and there's no response, it'll virtually shift the images one to the left and one to the right and see which way the hand has moved off the horopter. The horopter is the locus of zero disparity points. And in that way, it can keep the maximum area in that region on the horopter at fixation. So it's sort of doing spatial tracking. There's no model here. It'll track anything based on spatial constraints, based on the fact that the hand is separated from the background. I should say also, okay, you'll notice that my hand stays pretty stationary, and the computer moves, my head moves, but other things like this badge on my shirt here stays pretty stationary. That's because the locus of zero disparity points isn't restricted to just the Foveal, which is what this picture tries to explain. If I'm fixated on this small dot, this is the top view of the geometry of the camera. This is the horopter, loosely. This object is at zero disparity because in the left and the right image, it hasn't moved. Same as the fixation point. The circle is closer than the horopter, the square is beyond, so they move, and in fact they cross over. But there are more than one point that remain at zero disparity. But if you're looking at just just the fovea, well then this point doesn't come into play. So that's why it's useful to have foveal processing in this algorithm. Okay, and I guess that's all I need to say about that. Okay, so a bit of robustness. Other trackers, segmenters would have difficulty with these types of situations due to the scene. So a hand in front of a face, a color tracker would fail. A hand in front of another hand like this is really quite tricky to segment, but this does it well based on the spatial constraints. You can see that here my hands are separated by about 5 centimeters, 4 centimeters. Here they're actually touching. So when they're touching, it's segmented as one object, but here it's segmented as 2 separate objects. It was tracking the hand at the back, and it continues to track the hand at the back based on the spatial constraints. So that's tricky situations, and this is tricky image noise. So here you can see this, the contrast is a lot lower, the brightness is a lot higher here. It still does good segmentation. This is completely saturated. This is the contrast is maximized. It still segments. It's pretty robust. Here we've actually defocused the camera. Still gives a good segmentation. So it's a pretty robust algorithm. So and it enforces this stereo, coordinated stereo fixation and tracking. Okay, so then you can run the 2 algorithms side by side. You can build up this spatial awareness of where things are, and you can track the object that happens to be at the fixation point. You can continue to track it. So I think quickly show a demo of that. So there we go. So it's tracking the hand purely because the hand passed the fixation point, and it tells us that there's free space up to the hand, around the hand. The depth maps gives a good response to vertical edges. These land areas on the blackboard sometimes don't show up. But it's taking care of the motion of the cameras and all that. Okay, so yeah, it's finding mass in the scene. It knows what it looks like, knows how it's moving. It can retain fixation, but there's no concept of where to look. So basically this next body of work involves giving it the ability to scan the scene for regions of interest. So it's basically just data reduction, but it's attentional saliency that we're getting into now. So attentional saliency is where you try to look at things in the scene that are unique or different, and you try to track what you have seen before, so that well, we do this. You try to track what you have seen before, so you don't re-attend it, so that you're worried about the things that are novel in the scene. And we're only really dealing with novelty in terms of a pixel, in terms of the rest of the image. It's not geometric novelty or anything like that. It's pure bottom-up saliency. So this is the scene. This is the left view, almost. I'll put my hand in here to show a bit of flow. So we send the grayscale images to one server where it's processing intensity, uniqueness, flow, depth, and depth flow. The color image is sent to a color processor that processes center strand uniqueness on the color channels. Orientation is a series of log ball convolutions at different orientations and scales that give you orientation uniqueness. So things like this ball has the most unique orientation responses around it. So it comes out in the orientation sensitivity map. And we use log-bores because it's got a broader spatial response than the standard gabors, and it's known that that's the response, the cell response that happens in cats for this particular, for orientation sensitivity. So I'll get into how this is all set up in terms of a network processing structure later. But basically, you can weight these maps and add them and get a saliency map. These are all the cues that, well, most of the cues that I've used. So For example, the depth flow uniqueness skew depends on the depth flow, which depends on the depth skew. So you have to preserve this serial flow, but you can still do parallel processing, like the orientation uniqueness depends on the orientation map. So these are the relationships that have to be preserved in the processing structure. So there's serial and parallel processing possible if you want to do it as quick as possible. But anyway, this is basically, okay, it's a bit jumpy because PowerPoint doesn't like playing it back, but I won't bother opening it up out of it. But this is just the saliency map projected into the mosaic space. So you can see things like corners stand out, corner of the blackboard, edges stand out, colourful things like cone, uniquely oriented, or multiply responding orientation objects. That's the way it's going to respond. And you can project this back onto the occupancy grid as well, so you've got a 3D perception of saliency. I forgot to mention that these saliency responses bring out different features. So in terms of colour, black and white are the same chromins. They just vary by Y, the intensity. So it doesn't really come out the black on the white, the white on the black. The cone, of course, does. So the different processes bring out different features. So that's why you have to sort of look at all cues and add it together. And that's what happens in humans. Okay, so we've got an idea of what's salient, where we'd like to look, but you can't just let it run, otherwise it'll just saccade all over the place as things change, because if you change the viewing angle, you might introduce a little pixel of red, which all of a sudden becomes interesting in your otherwise black image, so to just keep looking around as the saliency map changes. So we inhibit areas that it has looked at, so that it won't look back at those regions in an attempt to reduce the saccadic nature of it. So basically, we smear out inhibition of return over the mosaic where we've looked. So this white area represents areas that we've fixated upon. I've just got the head doing sinusoids here, not actually fixating on anything. But the white area represents areas that we've previously had in the fovea. So we're less likely to put them back in the fovea. We'd rather look at the black areas. We've spent a lot of time looking at this area. We've evaluated it. Don't need to look at it again. So we spread out this inhibition of return, which is also biologically plausible. The retinotropic responses of these types of cells in humans also, the responses are suppressed as well in a similar sort of manner. Okay, but once you've suppressed something and it moves, what do? Well, we take care of that by dynamically updating the inhibition of return using flow. So I might start this film again. So the ball's directly in the fovea, and we've evaluated it, we've inhibited it by painting it white. The Coke bottle moves in, and initially it's not white, so, and it moves behind the ball and builds up this inhibition on it. Then the hand comes in and it's obviously not inhibited, but the ball moves and it keeps the inhibitants with it. So even though it's moved, we know we've looked at it before, it's been in the fovea, so we won't look at it again. We're kind of tracking it based on optical flow. Then the Coke bottle had been in the fovea, it moves out, so we know that, so we'll keep this inhibition of return. Something novel pops up, like the face. It hasn't been viewed before, so initially it's black, it stays in the fovea for a while, it gets suppressed, and we track the suppression. If we were to saccade, similar to primates, the concept of efference copy, we can copy this inhibition of return map by the distance that we've saccaded, and that's all taken care of by the mosaics. Okay, and this is the effect of that on saliency. So initially, the head is rather bright. I move it into the fovea, it gets suppressed. I reset the suppression on the forehead by just passing my hand in front. Don't know what's been behind the hand, so it's probably a good idea to have a look there again. Move it aside, and it takes the suppression of the mouth and the non-suppression of the forehead with it. So we're dealing with dynamic IOR. So you can see the mouth still suppressed, and I reset it. So that's the effect on saliency. You can also incorporate a spatial bias for any particular task. For say a forward search task, if this is the current view frame in the entire rectified mosaic, if we have this type of mosaic biasing, salient areas here will be amplified, salient areas out here will be suppressed a bit, so that'll tend to keep us looking at this central area. If we were driving a car, for example, we might like to put where we expect to find the road, increase the salience in that area, so it can saccade around to other things that are quite interesting, but it'll tend to keep its eye on the road, where the information is, where the pedestrians are. And you can update that dynamically, although I don't. There's potential to do that. So this concept of fixation, most people stop at saliency because they don't actually deal with active, real-time active. So they just say, all right, here's a saliency map, and you number brightest to lowest points, and you say, well, that's the scan path that we would take. But it really changes quite a bit as you change the view frame, so you really do need to calculate saliency each iteration. So we've got this concept of fixation, which is not just saliency, it's the product of saliency, that dynamic inhibition of return, and the task-dependent spatial bias. And it's all made possible by converting to the static reference frame of the mosaics. Okay. So I'll give an example of all of those systems combined. So just to give you an idea of the scene, here's a couple angles that you give the spatial. It's just a cluttered scene. So here's the thing operating. So this is the saliency map in the mosaic space. So as the cameras move around, although the contents seem to shift in the mosaic space, the head stays it stays in the same spot basically. You can see as I've saccaded to say the base of the cone, it gets suppressed. I saccade to the hand, it gets suppressed. Everywhere it looks, it suppresses, so you can sort of see where it's looked previously, and it's extracting and tracking the object that's been extracted. So it's looking at the ball, the mug, the base of the cone, top little ball, cone, the head. So, and it's doing coordinated fixation, so it's not just processing the left and the right, template matching, it's doing true coordinated fixation. Okay. So that's the demo. And this is just the same thing, but it's showing you where it's actually looking at with the image in the mosaic space. Okay. All right, so here's the server layout. Basically, every red dotted loop is a new computer, is a different computer. Some of them are quite, well, they're dual processor hyper-threaded, so they're virtual quad processors. Each one of these little blue boxes is a thread that's running on these computers. And this structure allows serial processing and parallel processing. So highly serialized processes are grouped together in the one server, so there's no network bandwidth taken up and transferring it to another area. So things that are serialized stick to the same area. Intensity images are processed in one area, color images are processed in the other area. And this is how I got those saliency center server maps. So that DSGS map that I showed you earlier is the output of this server, for example. Then you can weight all the outputs and combine them into a saliency map, and then the client can do whatever it wants. So the client could it could, for instance, modulate the weights of lower areas. It could do template map. It could do identification, classification, whatever higher process you want to do. So it turns out that purely by keeping serialized processes together and trying to minimize network bandwidth and minimize latency latency latencycy that it has the structure similar to the broad interactions in the brain. I don't want to push that too hard. There might be some biologists here, but basically the early Q processes sort of correspond to V1, V2, which are where these basic renotropic Q processing are grouped together. MRF-CDF server does target segmentation for classification, corresponds to the input and oral load, things like that. So basically that control loop is similar to what's going on in the active head. And it's emerged, it hasn't been a deliberate thing to do that, but it's just something that we've noticed and written about. But I won't push it too hard. All right, so it's basically primate-inspired, so it should operate somewhat like a primate. So here's a primate whose identity we should keep secret. So he's looking around at this truly 3D scene. Nobody's really done it with 3D scenes, non-bounded stimulus. Everybody's done it with videos. So that's where someone else is the cameraman and you're just looking at this fixed frame. But here the human can actually vary the frame, and which does affect the saliency. And also we want true depth because some of these cues respond to depth. And if you just have a single image, you can't really do that. And you can't really input depth to a human with two cameras without a complex sort of apparatus that might affect their viewing ability. But anyway, we use FaceLab to track the coordinates of his gaze. And you can see when the path is close together, he's sort of smooth pursuing. There is a fair bit of error in the FaceLab tracking, but then when there's a big line, he's obviously saccaded to another object. I'll start that again. So at the moment there's nothing in the scene, so everything's sort of equally salient. So he's saccading around a lot. But then if we introduce something that's salient, he'll track it for a while, and he'll get boring, and then he'll look away. So he's suppressed the saliency of that. Doesn't really want to look at it again, but he will once the inhibition on that returns. And you can see that he tracked the pair up as it rose. I've used a pretty bland background, not a non-interesting colour, so that objects look salient in front of it. I've used fruit because all fruit are iconically, conceptually sort of equal. Well, I hope they are. Maybe he likes some fruit better than others, but I'm assuming he doesn't. Okay, so we can track the velocity profile. I'm not really interested in the exact coordinates of where he's looking. I'm more interested in the velocity patterns and return rates, how long he spends doing smooth pursuit, how long he spends doing saccade, things like that. So you can look at the velocity magnitude timeline, and here it is here. And I've just taken a snippet here and shown you how I've marked up the data. So for areas that I'm actually actively moving something, I've boxed it green. So this might be corresponding to the apple moving, this might be the pear. If you look at the actual velocity histogram, you can see a cluster of low velocities and a cluster of high velocities. So you can segment what's saccade and what's smooth pursuit. These blue lines represent the saccades. Here's his entire scan path. It's pretty messy, but it's just to show you that yes, he does roughly look within the square. Sometimes he goes out and has a look at the ground or halfway towards the ground. But you'd also hope that when he's smoothly pursuing an object, that those points correlate well to the actual motion of the objects. And these arrows show the actual motion of the objects all superimposed in one. And it turns out that all the smooth pursuit points, which is these low points here, correspond to reasonably well. They're more dense at the areas where things are moving. So out in the top corner here where nothing actually moves, he didn't track anything. So here's the velocity profile. Well, actually it's a velocity, this is the velocity profile which doesn't tell us much. There are some little responses here at higher velocities, but they're so quick that they're sort of overshadowed by the number of smooth pursuit points. So I weighted by the distance, so multiplied by the time. and you can amplify the higher velocities, and it gives you this segmentation. So this is probably where he's tracking the low velocities. This is where he's circading around to different targets. And you can also analyze how many times he returns to particular objects in the scene. And it turns out, for the 20 people that I've looked at, 22 two pilots, it's roughly constant. So you'll roughly return to the apple once every 3 seconds. Well, Felix did that. Other people might be more saccadic, but they'll return to the apple once every 6 seconds, but they'll also return to everything else about the same frequency. So this sort of constant reattention period is sort of evidence of this inhibition of return, changing the saliency of objects so that you've got a sort of regime where you look at other objects again and return to them. All right, so we'd like the active head to sort of do the same thing. So it's exactly the same. Ran it in front of the same scene. It's looking around. It suppresses areas that are salient, gets a bit bored, but then something moving comes in and attracts it. Suppresses it, then starts looking around at other areas. So it's pretty much doing the same thing. Well, that's what I thought. Oh, okay, and here's the actual, that one also runs slow, so I'll run it outside of PowerPoint, it runs a bit faster. So this is a full trial with the robot, so it's just homing, it's finding where its parallel positions are, and then it can start the rectification process. Okay, so it's suppressing these areas that it's looked at. This is the saliency map. So it's looking at the background now. You can see it's segmenting out the background quite well. And it's a difficult background to do that on because there's a lot of aliasing in this bland sort of pattern, but it still does it quite nicely. Okay, so there the apple comes in, the orange, so it's back to orange, and segmenting it. Okay, so that trial continues. So I thought, oh, it looks like it's really doing exactly what Felix did, but it's not. It was doing far more saccading. This looks rather more geometric because there's a lot less noise in the gaze angles because I'm reading straight off encoders here. But it's too saccadic. And if you look at the rate of saccades, or the percentage of saccade frames, for Felix it was roughly 5 to 10%, but here it's 20% of the time it's doing a saccade, so it's far too saccadic. And there's not much track time. So just tuned the system a bit and basically decreased the decay rate in the inhibition of return, so things that were remained inhibited for longer. And I also increased the selectivity of the saccades. I didn't mention that I don't just saccade to the most salient point. I wait for a bit of information to accumulate about that saccade point. So it better say I'm the most salient point a couple of frames before I saccade to it, or it better be 10 times as salient as the last point, rather than just twice as salient before I saccade to it. So I increased the sensitivity decreased the sensitivity of the saccade filtering, so it was less likely to saccade until it got more information about the salient point. Did the trial again. I won't look through it again. And then I got that segment, the profile looks the same as in human. So the primate. So we've got these low velocities where it's tracking, and the saccade velocities, the higher saccade velocities. So I guess that's about it. So now I'm in the process of writing it all up. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew, for the very interesting talk. Are there any questions? Yes.
Did you have to get ethics approval to do experiments with primate Felix?
Yeah, I was hoping not to, but it turns out you do need ethics approval as soon as a human's involved. And It's not so torturous, this trial, but I still needed ethics approval. And I guess for those of you that did it, there might have been some fear. You know, I'm a nasty guy, I might have done something really nasty, and I'm putting these people in a black room where the visual stimulus is just controlled by me. So I did need ethics approval, which is a long process. If you've got to do that, do it months earlier than I did. Takes about 3 months.
What was the reason for trying to replicate the primate sort of percentage of viewing as opposed to try to make the optimum?
I just wanted to show that I can tune it so that it can replicate what a human does. All right, so a human's doing a lot of thinking about the objects that it's moved to. This obviously doesn't, but at least I can give it time to do that, and these instinctual bottom-up behaviours still occur. So I'm just saying, don't do anything for a little bit, whereas a human might be actually thinking about something, thinking about classifying the object, whatever. So you can control the time that you give to the client process from this bottom-up level. So if I had a classifier that was classifying apples, I don't need the classifier to know about how long I don't need the classifier to say, yes, I've classified that and move on. But you can instinctually sort of give the allocated amount of time for the classifier to operate, for example.
Just follow up on that. Did you control the time from the top down instead? So give the top level client time to think about the orange, or when it's decided
Absolutely.
that it has bought enough, then go look for something else.
All of the weights in the saliency maps, the timing, the radius of inhibition, the inhibition rates, can all be controlled by the client process. So it can do whatever it wants, but there is still this. The idea is to make it a flexible system so that you can do a task, but it's still aware of a ball coming towards you or things like that. So this bottom up always happens, but you can suppress the rates and change the rates at which things happen and concentrate on a task. So it's designed for task suitability for application.
The sort of question you supervisors shouldn't ask me. You know. Well, but anyway, do you want to? Can you give a sensible answer to expanding it all on what the human theories on dynamic inhibition and return are, and what the effect of your work is on those? Can you give a sensible answer to that?
So can we use this to have a look at humans and say, well, obviously they do this dynamic inhibition return? You mean
No,
use
is
this
there any
model to-
understanding of what's more possible in a human system? What is algorithmically possible in a human system that's shedding any light on how it could be done in human?
I can't really answer that. That is a cool question. This may not be what's happening in a human, but all I can do is observe the output behaviour at the end of the experiment and say the output behaviour is similar to what happens in a human. I don't know if a human actually does dynamic inhibition of return. They definitely do suppress cells that have responded, that have been catered to before, and they do copy these, like I said, this efference copy. They do copy suppressed cells across saccades. Monkeys do that, macaque monkeys. There's been investigations in that. And that's where I've got the ideas from, but I'm not sure I can go the other way. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
You said you did the test with 2 pilots.
Yep.
Did you notice any difference between the way they observed the scene and the way normal?
Yeah, Felix did one trial. The first one was more like everyone else, but then the second one he knew where to look. And it was much more relaxed, a lot less saccadic. So he knew that there was going to be fruit. Everybody else probably expected me to jump out. So his saccade rate initially was rather high, but then he's relaxed. So it was best to do the trial on level playing field and have everybody scared at the start. extensions, I'd like to put, we had a reading group yesterday where there was geometric and figure saliency, things like that. So given a picture, rather than just having a look at each pixel, there's actually structure there, like a circle, a line. That's obviously salient to a human. Let's make it salient to the system. And there's probabilistic models that we obviously read about yesterday that can help us do that. I'd like to actually do a task with it, like mount it in the car and look for pedestrians, put a pedestrian classifier on it, things like that, and actually use it. It's ready for use. There was also some interest from some psychology people who like to work with robots, but they always fudge the attentional step. So they have a white background and a bright orange pen. So it's and they just do color segmentation, things like that. But they can do it better with a more realistic system. So yeah, and I'd like to mount it on a mobile robot and actually do some mapping. So the occupancy grids, you can map the area. So if you walk down a corridor, you can map the walls as you go. And you can build in SLAM, things like that. So I'm hoping it's that flexible, and I'd like to work with tests.
Thank you.